Today's video is brought to you by AG1. It might just be a point release, but full self-driving beta 11.4.1 looks like a pretty major upgrade to Tesla's full self-driving beta. Elon Musk even says that arguably it should be called full self-driving beta 12. Let's take a look. Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. I just want to throw in a quick video here before I start with the main theme of the day. Anyway, this was from SpaceX and I just thought it was super cool. So I'm just going to go ahead and play it real quick here. It is a video. Of course, I'll put a link to this in the description and I'll put a link to the full self-driving beta release notes from Not a Tesla app as well. So check out this little guy here for scale, little guy. Anyway, you'll see what I mean in just a second. He's a normal sized human, but man, when you really start zooming out on this thing, it is absolutely nutty how big this rocket actually is. Pretty cool, right? Alrighty, on to all things full self-driving. So this was interesting. Nathan wrote to Holmar's blog and said, how confident are you that Tesla Vision and Occupancy Network will ever be as good as ultrasonics were at close range measurements? So if you don't know, of course, ultrasonic sensors were removed from Tesla's last year. I think last year, maybe it was 2021. Anyway, it was a while back at this point, and they're used for close-in measurements because they shoot out little sound waves and they bounce back. And of course, it's like radar, but it uses air instead. So anyway, it's ultrasonic sonar, but with the removal of that, Tesla has had to depend completely on vision to be able to do things like measure the distance from you to a curb or you to another car or something. So the question is, will this ever get as good as the ultrasonic sensors were? Holmar's catalog responded to that and said it will be better, and then Elon Musk responded much better. So interestingly enough, I have found with our Model 3, which doesn't have the ultrasonic sensors, that number one, it takes a little while for it to warm up. So it's like, can't do the parking thing yet because it hasn't started these sensors up yet, whereas the ultrasonics were always on right away. But number two, I've determined that they're not quite as accurate. It tends to underestimate distances. So when it says like 12 inches, it's actually more like 15 or 16 inches away from something, whereas the ultrasonic sensors are very accurate. So anyway, obviously what they're talking about here is in the future, but it's good news to know that we're actually going to get more accuracy, at least according to Elon Musk, than we do currently with the ultrasonic sensors. And then speaking of Holmar's catalog, when these release notes came out, he said feeding lane guidance into the occupancy network is smart. And of course, we'll talk about that later in the release notes themselves. But the important part for us right now is Elon Musk replied, as mentioned earlier, version 11.4.1 has major architectural improvements. It's actually much more than a point release, should arguably be version 12, but that's reserved for when full self-driving is fully AI from video in to control out. So there must still be pieces of the puzzle that are old world version 1.0 software. In other words, C, C++, that kind of stuff, where you have if-then statements, just a whole bunch of things like if this happens, then do this. If this happens, then do this. And of course, even a couple of years ago, Andrej Karpathy talked about this, how software 2.0 was going to eat software 1.0, software 2.0 being machine learning, neural network stacks, and everything. So obviously it's not completely there, but it is coming. And when we see version 12 of the software, that will indicate to everybody that we're a fully neural network stack from the beginning, from the photons in to the control output out. It's got to be very close at this point, 80 to 90%, but there's probably just a bunch of legacy stuff that's still in there. Possibly even things like smart summon and stuff like that is like old code and stuff. So by percent, it's probably not a lot of stuff, but it's probably going to require a good deal of work to get rid of that last little bit of legacy code. But anyway, something to look forward to with version 12 of the software. And before we get to the release notes themselves, here's a word from AG1. If you're like me, you think a lot about what you put into your body. So of course that means you want to eat right, exercise, and take care of your body. And one of the best ways that I've found to do that is AG1. This stuff is absolutely fantastic. I really am being honest here. I've been using it since February 1st of this year, and it has made a huge difference. I have so much more energy than I used to. I feel much more virile, and just ask misinformation about that. And I'm able to accomplish so many more things that I had been able to just a couple of months ago. It's got 75 vitamins, minerals, probiotics, prebiotics. It supports your gut health, your immunity, and on and on. And you know what? It tastes great too. It really does taste sweet. It has a hint of pineapple, and it doesn't have any added sugars, which is also really nice. And you know what else is great? If you click the link in the description, you get 5 free travel packs and a year's supply of vitamins D3 and K2. That's a pretty good deal. And lately I've been making use of the travel packs because I've been going to the gym in the morning and having to go straight from there to work. And I do intermittent fasting, so I don't want to eat first thing in the morning. So what I do is I just take a travel pack with me. I fill up the bottle with water at the gym. I put in the travel pack. I shake it up. I drink it on the way to work, and I feel fantastic for the rest of the day. So if you care about your health, your energy, your vigor, and etc., I highly recommend trying out AG1. And you know what? You can try it risk-free for 90 days. So what do you have to lose? So if you want to feel better today, click my link in the description, get your travel packs, the vitamins D3 and K2, and a 90-day risk-free trial. So take it from me, you've got nothing to lose and everything to gain. And in a couple of months, when you're feeling way better than you do right now, you can thank me. Alrighty, onto the release notes themselves. You can tell this time that it's not as big as previously, but there's a lot of stuff packed in here. If you haven't seen my full self-driving beta 11.4 release notes video, I will put it up here and at the end of the video because this syncs up with the 11.4 release. So it's definitely worth watching both videos to get a full sense of what this 11.4.x release is going to look like as we normal human beings eventually get it. All right, first up, improved control through turns and smoothness in general by improving geometry, curvature, position, type, and topology of lanes, lines, road edges, and restricted space. Among other improvements, the perception of lanes in city streets improved by 36%, forks improved by 44%, merges improved by 27%, and turns improved by 16% due to a bigger and cleaner training set and updated lane guidance module. All right, that's a mouthful, but what we're looking at here is smoothness. So remember, with 11.4, we had a lot of stuff with lanes. We're still dealing with lanes, navigation, everything like that. But this is all about smoothness. It's about going through turns. It's about staying smooth in lanes. And the more comfort that you can give to us monitors, I call it monitors, we're not really driving the car at that point, but we are monitoring it. And in order to keep us from intervening, the smoother the car drives, the less likely we are as human beings to intervene because we're not scared of what's going on. What you don't want is the car jerking around and everything because that's uncomfortable, and not only uncomfortable, but it gives you a lack of confidence in the vehicle. And so you're like, oh gosh, does it really know what it's doing? And at that point, you're much more likely to intervene, take over, and start driving yourself again. So this smoothness should help with our comfort, but also reduce the number of interventions we have. So that's the result. They do this by, quote, improving geometry, curvature, position, type, and topology of lanes, lines, road edges, and restricted space. Unfortunately, it's a little unclear exactly what they mean by improving. I assume what they're doing is improving the internal model that they have and helping this neural network model understand what all of these things are. It's unclear how they do that, whether they did that with a bunch of new data that they put in, whether they changed the architecture of the model or something like that. So we don't have real clear insight into exactly how they did this, but the result of this is that you get improved perception of lanes in city streets, 36% better detection of lanes, perception of lanes, so that it doesn't mistake lanes for not lanes or not lanes for lanes, things like that. Forks improved by 44%. That's a really big deal. So again, that's like an anti-merge when you're forking away from things. So it's important that the car knows where the lanes are as they split so that it doesn't jerk back and forth as it's trying to make a decision about which direction to go in the fork. Merges, which of course is the lanes coming together, improved by 27%, and turns improved by 16%. So I assume that means staying in your lane and being very smooth as you go through a curve and not, wiggling around. I found the Tesla for quite a while, at least on single lane roads, to be very, very good about maintaining a really good trajectory through a turn. Multi-lane roads, I think sometimes it does get confused when it goes through a high curvature situation. So maybe that's the part they're talking about in specific. But overall, this should be really nice for driver comfort. It should make us feel a lot more confident about the vehicle. Next up, added lane guidance inputs to the occupancy network to improve detections of long-range roadway features, resulting in a 16% reduction in false negative median detections. If you've been following these release notes, you'll think of false negatives as recall, because of course recall and false negatives both have to do with each other. And precision, of course, has to do with false positives, and we're going to get to more on that in just a minute. So the biggest upshot of this is apparently what it does is it detects medians much better than it did, a 16% improvement. In other other words, false negatives would be that you're driving up and you can clearly see that there's a median in the road, but the car doesn't detect that median. That would be a false negative. You don't really want that because you, of course, don't want your car driving up on the median. So this is a good thing that it's reducing the false negatives for medians. So how did they do this? If you don't know about the occupancy network, I will leave a link to that video up here if you're interested in looking at it. But basically, it's a network that just looks out in the world and it says, is something out there? It doesn't really say what is that thing. It's just interested in knowing what it is. Later on down the chain, it breaks it down semantically and tries to figure out if it's a car or a person or a curb or things like that. But the very, very first thing it does is it just says, is this voxel in space occupied or not? And interestingly enough, we just got back from a very long road trip, and so we've been on the highway, and I've been watching as you would drive by like tires or other pieces of junk on the side of the road. The car would detect it. It would show like a gray blob. It didn't understand what it was. It's like, I don't know that it's a tire, but I do know it's something that's there and I need to avoid it. So it's actually really cool to see this in action, but that's the output that you see from the occupancy network is, I don't know exactly what this thing is, but I know there's something there and I don't want to hit it. So what they're doing here is they're adding lane guidance inputs. So lane guidance is another module in the full self-driving. If you haven't seen John Emmons' video, if you haven't seen my video on John Emmons and his AI Day 2 presentation, definitely check it out up here. But anyway, lane guidance is a sort of a grammar of the lanes. It sort of figures out what these lanes are, where they are, how they're connected to each other, all of that kind of stuff. So apparently what it looks like they're doing is they're sticking that in at the front end of the occupancy network. I assume what they're doing is they're attaching this to the vision system. So you got a vision system that gives the occupancy network a whole bunch of pixels, and it says, here's the raw pixels coming in, but also here's the recommendations that we're getting from the lane guidance network, and we're going to add that together. So previously it was just raw pixels, and it was just looking around and saying what's occupied, what's not. What it looks like now is that they're integrating some intelligence into this system from the get-go. In other words, they're taking previous iterations, previous frames, previous seconds of the lane guidance network, and they're feeding that in and saying, hey, the lane guidance network thinks that we've got 2 lanes up here and a median over here and a curb here and all of that kind of stuff. It feeds that in so that the occupancy network has like a little bit of a head start, kind of a jump start on things as it tries to figure out what's occupied. And the upshot is that medians, I assume not just medians, but there should be other things that are detected more efficiently now as well. So as Holmar's catalog said in his tweet, that's pretty cool stuff, and I definitely agree. Next up, improved ego's assertiveness for crossing pedestrians in cases where ego can easily and safely cross before the pedestrian. So I know that what Tesla has done is they've dialed back the assertiveness of vehicles around pedestrians and bicyclists and things like that, vulnerable road users. But it looks like what they're doing now is they're starting to dial it back up, because there's a lot of cases where you're driving along, and I drive through a college campus all the time, and so there's students who are kind of hanging out at the edge of the road. But let's say you're on the right side of the road, you're in a right lane, and the student is just starting to cross on the left side of the road, or they look like they're about to. Currently what the car does with 11.3.6 is it will come to a stop and wait for that person to cross like all the way across the road, even though they haven't really even stepped into the road yet. So it looks like what they're going to say here is that the car will kind of make a determination like that person is over there. They have to cross 3 lanes before they would even impact me. They're not even quite in the road yet. Yeah, I can go ahead. The kind of human thing that you do, that calculus that you do in your head really quick, and you're like, yeah, I can totally get across the crosswalk area before that person even really gets into the road. So no big deal. I'm going to go ahead and go. So this will be helpful because, again, you either have to intervene and kind of step on the accelerator pedal and push it through, or you have to wait for the person, sometimes for an excessive amount of time. So again, this should really help out with interventions and help reduce those. Next up, we have improved motorbike recall. So remember, that's false negatives by 8%, and increased vehicle detection precision, which is false positives, to reduce false positive detections. These modules also add more robustness to variance in vision frame rate. So again, with motorcycles and bicycles and things like that, you don't want to not detect them when they're there, which would be false negatives. So that's the most important thing, right? You always want to detect a motorcycle when it's there. So they've improved the recall, or reducing false negatives, by 8%, but they've also reduced the false positives, which is detecting a motorcycle when it's not there. So those are both really good. The really fascinating part to me is this last sentence that says these models also add more robustness to variance in vision frame rate. So So again, the cameras are taking in raw pixels from the external world. They're putting that together into an initial neural network stack that goes in and sort of figures out what's there. That occupancy network would be part of that initial stack. And so what's going to happen is, if it's a complicated scene, it might take it longer to do this. So there will be more of a delay, more of a lag between when the initial visual stuff comes in and the output of those networks. So there can be variance. So if it's a relatively easy scene, it can go at a higher frame rate, essentially. I mean, think about it. The analogy that would make sense would be something like a video game. If you have a relatively light scene where you're just going through an open world or something, there's not a lot going on, the frame rate might be 60 frames per second. And then if you get into a big battle sequence with a whole bunch of NPCs fighting you and stuff, it might drop down to 30 frames per second. And obviously that variance in frame rates can have an effect on the downstream neural networks that Tesla's full self-driving beta is doing. So it's really cool that they're taking this network and they're improving the robustness to that variance. Next up, we have reduced interventions caused by other vehicles cutting into ego's lane by 43%. This was accomplished by creating a framework to probabilistically anticipate objects that may cut into ego's lane and proactively offset and or adjust speed to position ego optimally for these futures. So starting with the results, this is reducing the number of interventions required on our part, right? The monitor's part. So this is a thing where a vehicle cuts into your lane and the car overbrakes or something like that. Or potentially the car doesn't slow down enough, and either way we feel like we have to intervene. And in both cases that makes the driver feel uncomfortable, but also is an intervention. And of course Tesla is trying to get rid of those interventions. 43% is a lot. I don't know how they've tested this. Maybe this is with their internal team and they've discovered that. Maybe it's in simulations. I'm not exactly sure how they can determine that it's a 43% reduction without first putting it in the wider world so that we can test it. But however they're testing it, the result of this should be that you as a driver should not feel like you have to intervene when people cut you off in a lane. Really interestingly, they accomplished this by creating a framework, in other words, a model inside their FSD framework that probabilistically anticipates objects that may cut into the ego's lane and then proactively offsets or adjusts the speed to optimally react to this future. So basically it's doing a Monte Carlo simulation here, or if you don't know what that is, basically just rolling the dice. Monte Carlo, of course, being a very famous place for gambling. So they're looking at, it's rolling the dice. It's saying, what if this car does this? What if this car does this? What if this car does this? It's doing all of those things over and over and over again to see what could happen as things are going on, right? So if something happens, if and when a person cuts in, it's already thought about it. So if you're a good driver, you probably do this yourself. It's the kind of thing where you're in kind of a sticky traffic situation and you start thinking to yourself, okay, if this person cuts me off or if this person squeezes into my lane, how do I deal with that kind of stuff? It's that sort of thinking, that proactive thinking where you're thinking about potential outcomes in the future that should allow the car in this version of the software to react very, very effectively if somebody actually does that future. So this is getting into not just average driver territory, but very smart driver territory. And I think that's really cool that we're seeing full self-driving beta improve to the level where the vehicles are beginning to act like very smart drivers instead of just average drivers. Next up, we have improved cut-in control by reducing lane-centric velocity error by 40 to 50% for close-by vehicles. So it's a little unclear here whether they mean cut in as in the vehicle itself, the other vehicle will be cutting you in, or whether they mean the ego car, like our car, cutting into somebody else's lane. So I'm not exactly sure which one they're talking about here, because it looks like the note before where they're saying like the cutoff would be another person going into your lane, but maybe what they're talking about here is you needing to go into another lane. So you're driving in the left-hand lane of a two-lane road and you know you have to make a right-hand turn eventually and it's crowded, and it's a question of like, can I fit into that little gap that's between the two cars that are to the right of me? So that, I'm gonna guess, is what they're talking about, but it also could have to do with whether the car is cutting into your lane as well. But anyway, the way this is working in either case is it's taking the other vehicles and it's doing a better job of understanding what their velocity is, not just forward and backwards, but I think laterally, sideways in that lane. And so it's making a determination of whether the vehicle is moving towards you or away from you and how fast it's going. And the upshot of this is, I'm sure if you've driven full self-driving beta over the years or whatever, you see the cars next to you kind of flicker back and forth as they're driving, which indicates that the car itself doesn't really quite know exactly how fast they're driving, and so it's jiggling them back and forth because it doesn't quite have an understanding of how fast they're going. So a better understanding of how fast the vehicle is traveling will be really, really crucial to allow it to either understand if the car is going to cut into your lane, and or if your ego car has to move into the other lane, has to make a lane change. And improving velocity error by 40 to 50% is a really big deal. That's not just a little 5 or 6% improvement. That's 40 to 50%. So that should really, really help the car have confidence about how fast the cars around it are traveling. And continuing on with the lane encroachment theme, improved recall for object partial lane encroachment by 20%, high yaw rate cut in by 40%, and cut out by 26% by using additional features of the lane change trajectory to improve supervision. If we start at the start, improved recall means fewer false negatives of encroachment, so 20% less of that. So that would be where you're in this lane and the car's over here and you think it's moving into your lane and you brake suddenly and you didn't need to. So it should reduce the amount of false braking from cars that it thinks is encroaching. And then even more high yaw rate would be if the car is turning radically in the lane next to you, and there's a 40% improvement in its understanding of whether that vehicle is going to cut you off or not, and then cutting out is improved by 26%. So that would be a car in front of you and whether they're actually leaving your lane or not. And a lot of times I'm sure people who've driven full self-driving beta will know that the car will be cutting out of your lane and you could safely go past them because of their trajectory, but the car will still brake and then wait till they're fully out of the lane and then accelerate again. So it's uncomfortable, it's annoying, it's not terrible, but it's annoying. So if it can be smooth and it can allow that car to get out of the lane without braking and just continue moving forward, that will be a big improvement. So how they've done this, my guess here, and they're not really explicit, but my guess is that what they're doing is they're adding additional features to the loss model. In other words, the way that it determines whether or not the car is doing the right thing, they're adding additional features of the lane change trajectory to improve the supervision. The supervision, of course, is the teacher that goes like bad AI and tells it whether it's good or bad or something. So the improvement of supervision is being done by adding additional features of trajectory and lane change and things like that. At least that's my guess. It could be something else. Again, a lot of times these things are not super clear, but that's my best guess as to what's going on. In any case, the car should not brake as much as it used to by encroachment, by false encroachment, by cars moving out of your lane but not quickly enough, all of that kind of stuff. It should be smoother in those situations. That's the outcome. Almost done here. Thank you for sticking with me. Next up, reduced highway false slowdowns related to underestimated velocities for faraway objects by adding 68,000 videos to the training set with improved auto-labeled ground truth. So this is rather interesting because with the new full self-driving stack, on the highways, I'm seeing a lot more false slowdowns, which are things where you're just driving and all of a sudden the car just kind of slows down for no reason and there's nobody right in front of you, things like that. So it looks like what's going on with that is it's seeing things far up in the distance and underestimating the velocity. So if a truck is like 400 or 500 meters ahead and it's going the same speed that you are, but it underestimates that velocity, it might start to slow down because it's like, oh crap, I'm going to hit that car really soon because it's standing still in the road, something like that. So what they've done is they've added 68,000 videos, I assume specific ones where it had false slowdowns, to the training set, and they've improved the auto labeling of the ground truth. So what they've done is they've gone in and the auto labeler has figured out what the actual velocity of that object that's in front of you is, as opposed to what the car thought it was, and it's retraining that. So full self-driving is being taught, no, it wasn't going 20 miles an hour, it was actually going 65 miles an hour or something like that. So you didn't actually need to slow down. So this should reduce the number of false slowdowns on the highway, which, as I said, we did a very long road trip and we did have some instances of that where you're like, why is the car slowing down for no reason whatsoever? So anyway, hopefully this exact thing will take care of that problem. This next one relates to full self-driving 11. Whatever beta, smoothed in-lane offsetting for large vehicles by tuning the amount of lateral jerk allowed for the maneuver. So a big improvement with full self-driving 11. Whatever is that if you have a truck next to you or something, the car will move out of the way to the other side of the lane. But sometimes I've experienced it does this a little bit jerkily. It'll come up and go boop and move to the side and then boop and move back again. So it looks like what they've done is they've tuned it so it's a little bit smoother and it moves away from the vehicle and back into the middle of the lane more smoothly so that hopefully you don't even notice that it's doing it. And finally, improved lateral control for upcoming high curvature merges to bias away away from the merging lane. So again, it's a little unclear what they're talking about here, whether you're in the merging lane merging onto a highway or whether you're in the highway lane and a merge lane appears or something. I think it's you're in a regular highway lane and a merge lane appears, and at the same time there's a big curve. And the reason why I think it's the latter case is that often what will happen is that the vehicle, you'll be driving along in the middle of the lane and then the merge lane will come about. And I hadn't thought about the fact that it might have to do with curvature, but often the car will slide over to the right as if it's merging now and then move back to the left. So what they're saying is under these circumstances, you're driving down the road, a merge lane appears and suddenly your lane gets really, really fat as the merge lane is there, and then it shrinks back up again, and the car will bias towards the left-hand side of the road rather than the right-hand side of the road. So again, that should make things smoother, and it should make it so you don't feel like you have to take over as much in those situations. All right, so that was relatively few notes, but as I said, that was a lot of information packed in there. My general takeaway, as with Full Self-Driving Beta 11.4 release notes, is that Tesla is really moving to comfort and to dealing with edge cases and to trying to reduce the number of interventions we drivers feel we need to do. It's getting less and less safety critical and more about the comfort of the driver and reduced need to do interventions with the vehicle. And as I've said before, these are huge improvements because every time we feel more comfortable with the car and we understand what it's doing better, it means that we feel more comfortable allowing it to drive for longer distances without any interventions. And now, of course, we all just have to wait until they actually release version 11.4.1 to the public so we can all try it out. All right, I hope you enjoyed this rather geeky video and found it fun and interesting and thought-provoking. If you did, please do like it so other people can find it. And of course, consider subscribing for more of this kind of content. As always, a huge shout out to my patrons on Patreon and my YouTube channel members. Thank you all so much for your support. I truly do appreciate it. And if you want to join the team, just check out the link in the description. And if you're interested in a whole bunch of really cool merch, check out our merch store. Link is in the description. We have TeslaBot t-shirts, the Tesla meme t-shirt, Success is a Possible Outcome, 4680 battery cells. All of that stuff is on t-shirts, mugs, tumblers, and on. So check it out. And finally, a big thanks once again to AG1 for sponsoring this video. Definitely check them out, get your 90-day risk-free trial, and feel better soon. And in the meantime, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.